So we're back to some slides. Uh, this next series of slides is going to be dealing with sexual harassment reporting. But before we get there, I want to return to what I was speaking about at the beginning of these videos, and that is the function of culture. When it comes to sexual harassment reporting, it's not enough to simply have the mechanisms that we're going to talk about in a second or that are laid out in a policy. We also have to have a culture that encourages behavior, that encourages reporting when it comes to addressing a sexual harassment or a discrimination type of claim. So culture matters here, and it should be making reporting easy. We do that through the policies. Accessible, again, through the policies, the availability of alternates to alternate paths to making a report. And finally, we need to make it acceptable. See, oftentimes the victim of sexual harassment feels isolated. They feel like there's no mechanism that they can use to report it. They feel like there's no mechanism that they can get some sort of redress for a real problem that they are experiencing. And if we have a culture that makes it even remotely unacceptable or difficult to make a report of sexual harassment or discrimination, we are never going to create the culture that prohibits or that makes sexual harassment not only unacceptable, but makes it difficult to happen in. So reporting needs to be acceptable. We need to be telling each other, management and employees need to be telling each other it's okay to report it. Culture matters, and it should make everybody accountable for their conduct. Now, I want to be clear here because it's easy to begin to interpret this as we need to be a police state. We need to be reporting what's going on. That is not the case. That is not what I am suggesting. But I am suggesting that if you're going to own the culture and you see something that you don't want to be happening in your culture, you need to address that behavior yourself. Pull that coworker aside and say, hey, look, that thing that you just did, you may not think that it's a problem, but it's a problem for me. And it may be a problem for the person that you were just dealing with. And that's not the kind of place that we want to work in. So you want to be polite, you want to be thorough, but you also want to give that person an opportunity to correct their behavior, to redeem themselves. Now, that's not to say that egregious conduct should not be addressed through a formal reporting system. But culture is reinforced by behavior. Culture is reinforced when it is owned by everyone, and when everyone is holding themselves and their coworkers accountable for operating in a professional but personable environment, things go a long way. That makes the culture the predominant factor in avoiding sexual harassment. The culture should be based on the golden rule. We all learned the golden rule when we were kids. The golden rules is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Remember when I talked about being accountable? You have to make your employees and your workers and your co-workers accountable for their actions, but you too have to be accountable for your own. You have to be accountable for your conduct, and you have to remember that the conduct that you show is the conduct that you will receive. So if you make it unacceptable to report sexual harassment, if you refuse to hold somebody accountable when their behavior steps over the line, you're never going to create a culture that allows you to feel comfortable around your coworkers. Finally, the culture should be protecting all workers. The culture protects you. The culture protects the workers on your level. If there's a multi-level employment structure, it protects your supervisor. It protects your subordinates. A culture that does not permit sexual harassment, that holds people accountable, protects everybody. And it goes back to the golden rule. If you turn a blind eye to harassing behavior that is affecting a coworker, what is that coworker's incentive to protect you when the chips are down? Now, again, I want to be careful. I am not suggesting that we go looking for harassment, but I am suggesting we start looking at ourselves and we start looking at our coworkers and holding each other to a higher standard of behavior. This is a workplace. It's not a place where that kind of behavior, where sexual harassment is permitted. And the more we do this in our workplace, the more it extends out to beyond simply the workplace. I am not suggesting that people are going to be perfect. I am not suggesting that mistakes are not going to be made. But we do need to, by holding people accountable, still offer them a path to redemption. So the formal mechanisms of reporting sexual harassment. These formal mechanisms are going to be laid out in your employee handbook or in a separate policy document that you'll be given. If your employer has contracted with my firm to provide an employee handbook, I can guarantee you it's in the employee handbook. It will be specific. It will tell you who to report sexual harassment to. And it will be as plain English as we can possibly make it. The process is going to require a written report. I wish I could get around having oral reports and things like that, but frankly, it's not possible. The written report will start the formal process of an investigation. By documenting it, we can make sure that we have all of the necessary behavior that is being questioned, is being investigated, and we can address all the possible issues. It gives me as the company attorney, and it gives other investigators a starting point. The report is often made to one of many different individuals. Oftentimes it will direct you to start with your supervisor, but of course if your supervisor is the party who is harassing you, that makes it very difficult. So often the path is to go to owners or to go to other management and potentially even outside agents. For example, for many of my smaller employers who are clients, many of them will use me as a reporting mechanism. So somebody can report to me a sexual harassment violation, and I can guarantee you if I get the report, there will be a thorough investigation, and it's probably going to be unpleasant for the owners because I hold the owners accountable for the culture that they operate. I do want to take a quick step down and talk about outside agency reporting. Under the law, an employee has the absolute right to report to either the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or a relevant state agency any kind of sexual harassment or discrimination. Let me repeat that again. While we encourage internal reporting so that we can address it internally, and as much as the employer, your employer, my client may object, you still have the absolute right to report outside to the EEOC or to state agencies. That may inhibit your ability to get relief right away because they have a very specific process, but it is your right to do so. If your company has 15 or more employees, the EEOC does have jurisdiction. If you have 14 or fewer employees, the state agencies will have jurisdiction. And if you're both, the state agencies can also conduct investigation of larger employers as well. The sexual harassment reporting is going to lead to an investigation. And we'll talk a little bit more about the investigation in just a moment. The investigation is the natural course. If that is what when you're making a report, you should be cognizant that that's what's going to happen. And sometimes those investigations can be mighty uncomfortable. Sexual harassment reporting often leads to counseling and discipline. Some of that counseling and discipline may be uncomfortable. However, I want to return to the culture. The culture is one where we hold people accountable for their behavior. That accountability may not be exactly what you want, but it should be expected that there is going to be some counseling. And as much as people think that any sort of sexual harassment should immediately lead to termination, it doesn't always lead there. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So reporting, we make it as easy as possible, but do bear in mind it's going to require a written statement. It's going to be, you're going to have to report it to somebody, and while it may feel like you are in the wrong, or it may feel like it victimizes you further, if you do not report sexual harassment, it is very, very difficult for supervisors and management and ownership to address the problem. Sometimes addressing the problem requires more than just a coworker pulling aside the harasser and saying, don't do that. Sometimes it will require management to get involved. We want it to be easy, but we also want it to be acceptable. But without a report, it is impossible for management and ownership to make any changes. Sexual harassment investigation. Once it begins, it is the natural outflow from a report of sexual harassment. So the investigation should be prompt. Now, when I say prompt, I don't mean it's necessarily going to start the minute the report has been made. There may need to be some contact to outside counsel or an outside HR expert who is experienced in conducting sexual harassment investigations. So maybe your employer is looking for guidance on how best to go about it. Now, when I say it may not start immediately, it also shouldn't be waiting a week, or it might be a week. It shouldn't be waiting multiple weeks or a month before it begins. It should be prompt. It's going to be thorough. It needs to be thorough. Sexual harassment and allegations of sexual discrimination are very serious. They should be addressed with seriousness, and they should be investigated with a thoroughness warranted by the allegation. The problem with thoroughness is that, try as an employer might, they may not be able to keep everything confidential and private. If you are the victim of a harassment, particularly if it's an egregious harassment, it is going to be difficult for an employer to keep your name completely anonymous. And as uncomfortable as that may sound, that is the nature of an investigation. We have to ask the questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how. There's no way around that. And a thorough investigation means that people are going to know. They're going to start to figure it out. People aren't stupid. 4 of your coworkers are called in to ask, why was this person crying, or why was this person so shaken up? They're going to figure it out pretty quick. So it is going to be thorough, and with the thoroughness does not necessarily come complete anonymity. So just sort of be mindful of that. Sexual harassment is an intensely emotionally charged allegation. There's no way around that. The victim has certain feelings. The harasser, once they are approached and accused, they're going to have an immediate reaction, and those reactions are going to be emotional. But a thorough investigation is about the facts. Obi-Wan Kenobi once said that truth depends greatly upon our own point of view. The victim and the harasser and the witnesses to any of this, they all have their own point of view. The goal of the investigator is to find out the facts, stripped from as much emotion as possible, so that we can figure out what happened, and so that we can begin to address the consequences of the activity. The investigation is going to address the effect on the victim. Was this a quid pro quo sort of situation where the victim was told, you have to sleep with me if you want your pay raise? Or is this an ongoing pattern of behavior that has sort of accumulated things over time? Sort of like silt, or on a sandbar. The accumulation of injury, the accumulation of problems, that creates an effect on the victim. and we have to address what that effect is. The investigation also needs to address the conduct by the harasser. Now, I'm not excusing ignorance, but oftentimes in hostile workplace environments, the harasser may not be aware of the harassing nature of their ongoing conduct. So we have to address what that conduct was. Some things are very simple. Sending pornographic pictures to your coworkers, that's bad. That's easy to address. You know, the off-color joke, it's a little bit harder to address. The references to somebody's appearance may be hard to address over time. So we have to address the conduct. And I want to say something about counseling and discipline. It's, for whatever reason, becomes sort of the belief that if you were accused of sexual harassment, you're going to be terminated, and that the victim has a right to expect their harasser to be terminated. That is not the case. That is not the law. Is it appropriate? Yes. Sometimes it's appropriate, and sometimes it's not. So the victim should not be expecting termination of the harasser. By the reverse side, the harasser should not be surprised if he or she is terminated. The punishment or the discipline or the counseling that is conducted by the employer should be proportional, it should be relevant, and it should address both the effect on the victim and the effect on the harasser. So we do want to make sure we are addressing what is going on. We want to make sure that we are addressing the conduct, but doing so in a proportional way. I go back to the culture thing again. You want to offer both the victim and the harasser a path to redemption, a path to professionalism, a path to a place where the culture doesn't permit this activity, but doesn't so punish a mistake that everybody lives in fear. So the reporting process is one that folks need to understand is going to happen. It's going to result in an investigation that is prompt, thorough, and fact-based, but not necessarily anonymous.